Hello everyone. How are you? Welcome to the stream again. How are you? Can everyone hear me properly? Can everyone hear me properly? There seems to be echo. Is that better? Seems to be echo. Is that better? No. Um okay, I have no idea why there's echo. Okay, I have no idea why there's Is that better? Are you still getting echo? Not anymore. Okay. So I have my computer audio on. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, and for sticking. There is an echo. I don't know. Don't do Twitch. Thanks for being here. Hopefully the echo will go off. I think I turned off the volume in my laptop, and that should be better now. Um, well, thank you for sticking with the channel. I appreciate it. This is this is very nice of you. We are about 18 people now and growing, so that's great. So I thought I would talk first about a little bit about housekeeping stuff. So the first thing is, as you will notice, I'm getting a little bit better as time goes by. Now there's a little title in the feed. I learned how to do that recently. I'm very proud of it, even if it's very basic. So I'll eventually get better and better at this. Um, then the second thing is I will um, I have opened up a YouTube channel. You can see the link in the description, and if you click there, that's where I'll put the episodes because the episodes are only saved for like 7 days. The each stream here on Twitch, and so if you click on the YouTube channel, you will be able to find there. Once they disappear from Twitch, I'll put the episodes on YouTube so that you can keep them for longer periods. Um, and then the last thing is, well, everyone was talking about whether playing video games would be a good idea, and I thought, yeah, it would be a good idea. So the next thing I will do is um, let's. I wanted to play The Last of Us, which is a game that I'm very good at and and that I enjoy very much. And while we play, discuss issues of human rights and armed conflict. So hopefully that'll be entertaining for you. And I'm planning that on this Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time. That's the only slot I have, unfortunately. So if you want to do that, if you prefer that, if you prefer like to talk about international law while playing video games, we can do that on Wednesday, and then Sundays will be just chatting. Um, hopefully that's fun for you. I'm very excited about it. I hope it'll be fun. Um, and yeah, eventually we can do more games. Anyway, the plan for today was to do a Q&A on Palestinian statehood. So as before, I have prepared some notes. I can just talk. But if any of you has any questions, feel free to put it on the chat, and I will um, just be able to answer your questions. Now we're 17 people, I think, watching right now, so it'll be a little bit easier than last time where it was like 80 something. Um, but hopefully the channel will continue to grow, and so it'll be um, it'll be a steady community of people that are interested in international law. Um, your questions only about Palestinian statehood? I mean, let's call it the theme of the day. But if you want to ask anything related to the topic, I'm okay with that. So no, it doesn't need to be only about Palestinian statehood. But that's what I mean, if no one asks any questions, that's what I'll be talking about. Um, okay, so before I start, does anyone have any question that wants answered, like burning questions? Okay, well, if you think of any questions that you want answered, then just write it on the chat and we can talk about it. Oh, there's one. Does the advisory opinion of the ICJ also cover occupied Syrian Golan Heights? If not, can the recent ICJ opinion be used to force Israel out of the Golan? So that's an interesting question. Relates to Palestinian statehood because it talks about what is the territory of Palestine, and since the ICJ opinion was premised only on the Palestinian territory, I mean, the territory that belongs to Palestine. It does not cover the occupied Golan Heights because, like Iconoclast 94 says, it's Syrian territory. So no, the ICJ opinion does not cover the occupied Golan Heights. But in general, like the general opinion of the court on occupation and what are the rights of Palestinians in occupied territory are applicable to that, right? Some of the things from that opinion will definitely be useful going forward, even if it does not apply specifically to the Golan Heights. Why was there never a Palestinian state recognized in the 40s or 50s, but Israel was recognized? Okay, so this is a great question, I think to do that, let me just start from the very beginning. So maybe we should start on what is a state as a starting point to this question. Cheryl Benson, I'll get to your question in a second. But let me just start with what is a state, and then I can answer more questions. So traditionally, like in international law, traditionally we say that there is a state whenever there is a territory, a specific defined territory, where a specific population permanently lives, so permanent population, and where a specific government has administers the territory effectively, and that government can engage in international relations. So essentially, it's defined territory, permanent population, effective government, and ability to engage with other states. That is, let's say, the rule book version. That is what it's on the books. That's contained in the 1933 Montevideo Convention. Okay, but the concept of a state is a little bit more than just law. There's no formula. Like states are more complicated than that. And there's a lot of politics that goes into it. So, for example, take the Vatican City state. Vatican City it has a territory. The Vatican City. It has a territory. It's a government. The Holy See. It does engage in relations with other states, but it doesn't really have a permanent population because the people who live in the Vatican City, even though they live in a state, they're priests, they're bishops, they're cardinals. They go there and then they leave, and it's basically where they work. Most of them, even many of them, just live outside of the Vatican. They live in Italy. So the very idea of state is a tricky one, is a political one. Some states that are states don't comply with the legal requirements of statehood, and some states that are not legally recognized or majorly recognized as states do comply with all of them. Like take Taiwan, for example. Like Taiwan is a classical example of a territory that has international relations, a defined territory, a permanent population, and a government, and yet is not recognized as a state by the majority of the world. I think only some Central American states and I think Paraguay recognize Taiwan as an independent state. So bear that in mind as we go forward on this question of why was Palestine recognized? Why was Israel recognized, but Palestine was not? Okay. Let me just go through the question. What can be done to force our country to recognize the state of Palestine? Being Canada, who has 80 years of history, supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and supporting Zionism, they refused, and also they do some degree of support for illegal settlements. Yeah, Cheryl Benson, this is something I will touch upon in a little bit, so don't worry, we will get to it. And whether I can outline the forms of state that Palestine might take. I heard you refer to Westphalian states last time. Are there any other common forms of state in the modern world? Yeah, sure. We can touch upon that as well. So now that we have an idea of what is a state, what is legally and politically a state? Let's talk about Israel and Palestine concretely. Okay, what is the traditional version, the mainstream history of the emergence of Israel as a state? Right. The main story, the main argument as it goes is there was a partition plan in 1947, and the two parties involved Arabs in Palestine and Jewish people in Palestine, the Jewish people represented by the Jewish Agency for Palestine, um, had to decide whether they wanted to recognize this partition plan, meaning that two different states would be created in the territory that at that time was called the Mandate of Palestine. Right. And as the story goes, then one state recognized it, one community recognized it, meaning Israel, and then they became an independent state, and another community, the Arab population of Palestine, did not, and so they did not become a state. And that is how it sort of like goes. That is how most people will explain it. I don't have the same position. I think differently. And to understand where I come from, we need to go a little bit further back than 1947. Okay, and to the days of the Palestinian Mandate. What is the Palestinian Mandate? Okay, so when World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire lost, the territory of the Ottoman Empire was divided into different portions and allotted to specific um, European powers. So mainly the UK and France. And so these territories were not exactly meant to be colonies, because the people that were going to live in these new territories were not going to be considered French or British subjects. They would be their own thing. But they were not allowed to be independent still, because, like we discussed last time, there's this little thing called the standard of civilization that makes world order organize human communities into categories: those that are civilized, those that are semi-civilized, and those that are not civilized. And so, even though at this point we were discussing about self-determination and whether empire should be dissolved, it was never in the sense that non-Western populations deserved self-determination as well. Right? This was a big step for like racist Europeans to take. And so they didn't decide that just if you're going to divide the Ottoman Empire into different parts, each part should be independent. So the Covenant of the League of Nations, the organization that was created after World War I, established that to disassemble the Ottoman Empire, these regions that had attained a sufficiently advanced level of development, but were still not able to, quote, stand by themselves in the international community, would need to I just saw Cheryl. I just saw you mentioning that I need to talk slower, so I will. So these territories of the Ottoman Empire were not exactly recognized as fully ready to be independent, and so they were set up in the form of a mandate. What is a mandate? It's a specific limitation on what those territories can do, because they will be the powers of those territories that a state would normally have would be allotted to another, to a mandatory. In this case, in the case of Palestine, for example, the United Kingdom. Right? So in traditional understandings, mandates are not states. They're something else. And my question is, okay, if they're not states, what are they? What is a mandate? It's definitely not a colony, because in a colony, then Palestinians would have been British citizens, and Palestinians in mandatory Palestine were not British. They were Palestinian. They had their own nationality. Right? It's not an international entity, the property of the Covenant of the League of Nations, because specifically the League of Nations says that the territories will be allotted to a mandatory, so not under the control of the League of Nations. So if they're not a colony and they're not an international administration, what is a mandate? So international lawyers at the time, they were very reticent to accept that non-Western populations could be sovereign and independent. It didn't make sense. So they would say, we don't know what these things are. Like there's a famous passage in an opinion at the International Court of Justice in the South Africa case that where Judge McNair, one of the leading scholars at the time, said, well, we don't know what happened to Ottoman sovereignty when the Ottoman Empire disassembled. So we're just going to pretend that sovereignty, that Ottoman sovereignty, is in abeyance. It's just there, somewhere in the cloud, but doesn't really exist as popular sovereignty. Because non-Western peoples with popular sovereignty, what kind of crazy language is that, right? And so they didn't know what happened to that sovereignty. I think nowadays we should know, right? The idea of popular sovereignty in non-Western populations should really not be taboo. So my position, and take this with a grain of salt because it's um, my position. It's not necessarily the most popular one, but it's the one that makes sense to me reading the documents, is that mandates were states. Right? In fact, when you read the constitutions of the Syria mandate, for example, they say mandates the mandate of Syria is a state. Like Syria is a state that blah blah blah. Or when you look at the mandate of Iraq, for example, the mandate of Iraq was created through an international treaty between the British and the Iraqis, and the British accepted that a king, an Iraqi king, Faisal I, would rule mandatory Iraq. So there is an international figure that sort of looks like a mandate. The figure that looks like a mandate is the protectorate. What is a protectorate? Where a protector decides to protect a protectee, a protected party, that is an independent party. You don't lose your independence because you become a protectorate, at least in theory. So, because protectorates have been misapplied throughout history a lot as a tool of colonization, but at least in the theory, when your own popular sovereignty is limited by someone like that comes on top of you, in this case the British, then your sovereignty is limited, but that doesn't mean that you don't have sovereignty. So in my view, the way I see Palestinian statehood, mandatory Palestine was, for all intents and purposes, a state already, right? And wasn't it the mandatory's purpose to guide the mandatee to sovereignty? Yes, that is another thing. The whole point of the Covenant of the League of Nations, thank you, Jay Vickers, the whole point of the mandate system was that you would put a quote unquote more advanced mandatory to guide this less civilized mandatee civilization towards a higher level of civilization so that they can be independent. Very racist, very like colonial mentality. Yeah, I know, Jens, but like since you just write J Vickers in your avatar, I cannot really disclose your name without your consent. So now I have your consent. So yeah, Jens. um, anyway, so um, we have this situation where the Covenant of the League of Nations specifically says that these populations that come out of the disassembled Ottoman Empire are now are recognized provisionally as independent nations. And so let's treat them as independent nations, right? So when the mandate ended, you can either think, okay, then therefore whatever remained was nothing because non-Western peoples cannot have sovereignty, popular sovereignty. So when the mandate goes away, what remains is a piece of land that has no owner. And so you get into all sorts of problems as to what to do with this land called the West Bank and in Gaza. Or you conclude that the mandate is just a set of limitations that are applied to a specific population, right, to a specific state. And so when the mandate is removed, what remains is the state of Palestine. So this is my position. My position is that Palestine has been a state since the mandate era. And not say that it became this weird thing post-mandate that isn't a state but isn't also like a non-state. It's a something else, and so therefore it can be occupied by whoever, by Jordan, by Egypt, by Israel. I don't subscribe. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Right? So in my view, Palestine was a state since at least 1922. This is a very minoritarian view. Not a lot of people agree with me, but this is what makes sense to me from reading the documents. So when you look at the world from this perspective, from my perspective, and you go then to that 1947 partition plan again, in this scenario, you have the United Nations proposing to some of the parties, let's divide the land between you, the Jewish sector, and the Palestinian sector. But as you noted, the Arabs and Palestinians refused a separate state because they refused, in my opinion, to acknowledge Israel. Thanks, Cheryl. So yeah, so here's the tricky thing. Why is it that the Arab populations of Palestine did not accept partition, right? And they didn't do it because they didn't want their own territory, their whole territory of historic Palestine, divided. Israel did accept that. Well, at least the Jewish Agency for Peace did accept that a partition plan. So they said we would like to create a different state. Now the key question here is, was this partition plan ever implemented? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, the Arab populations did not accept the partition plan, and the Jewish populations did. Therefore, that's why there's one state in Israel and there's no state in Palestine. You already know my argument as to why I contest that there's no state in Palestine. But if the partition plan had been implemented, then you would need to use all of its provisions. You would not be able to pick and choose what provisions you use to constitute the specific state called Israel, right? So the provisions of the partition plan in 1947 are that, one, most important of all, Jerusalem will be a quote-unquote corpus separatus, meaning that Jerusalem would not be a part of either the Palestinian or the Israeli states. Right? The borders of the Jewish state in the partition plan would not be the same as the borders of the current Israeli states. They were much smaller. Unfortunately, I still don't have the knowledge on how to make a map pop up here in the screen for you. That would be super useful, but I have no idea how to do that. Maybe next time. But the borders of the supposed Jewish state in the partition plan were much smaller than the current borders of the state of Israel. And then finally, there needed to be sort of a waiting period from the moment of accepting partition to the moment where the states will be created, because you needed to divide essentially the government of the Mandate of Palestine into a government for the Jewish state and a government for the Palestinian state. And because these two states would need to coexist in very tight-knitted ways, the partition plan required a customs union, a complete economic union between the Jewish and Arab states in partitioned Palestine. None of that has been implemented, right, at any point in Israeli history. In fact, while Israel's independence declaration does mention that it is inspired in the partition plan, it really doesn't assume a commitment to, fully apply and implement the partition plan. So was Israel created as a result of it accepting the partition plan? I don't think so. Yes, I can repeat that. Thanks, Cheryl. My point is, could we claim that Israel was created as a result of Israel, as in not the Jewish Agency for Palestine, not the Jewish community, but Israel as a state? Was it created because it decided to implement the UN partition plan, yes or no? And my argument would be no, because to implement the partition plan, you would need to comply with it. And Israel has never complied with it. It didn't create a corpus separatus for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under Israeli occupation. East Jerusalem is under Israeli occupation, and it's been annexed. There's no economic union between Israel and Palestine. And the borders of the state of Israel are different from the Jewish state in the partition plan. So Israel really did not become a state because it complied with the partition plan. It didn't ever apply it. Cheryl, what do you mean regarding something about trade agreements? In essence, if you are going to apply the partition plan, then you need to apply it, and Israel has never done that. So my argument, and in this I'm not alone. This is also the argument of James Crawford, which is one of the leading scholars in the theory of state creation. If you want to read his book, it's called The Creation of States Under International Law, or The Creation of States in International Law by James Crawford. He was one of the best legal scholars ever. And so the argument there is that if the partition plan was never accepted and implemented, then what is the basis for Israel existing, right? Let me see. Israel, Iconoclast 94. Israel accepted the partition plan, but they declared independence outside of this plan. How did it become an accepted state despite Palestine not getting its share of the plan? Yeah, that is exactly the point, right? So up until this point, you have a discussion about whether Palestine is a state. I think it was in 1947 already a state. Most people think it was not a state. Okay. And you have this idea that there was a partition plan and that Israel decided to accept this partition plan. I contest that, and I said the Resolution 181 of the United Nations, the partition plan was never actually implemented by Israel. So how is it that Israel exists? Right? So here's the interesting part. James Crawford, in his book, says, look, there are many ways through which a state can emerge. Right? A state can be basically declares independence if it is a colony, or a state just is like I don't know, it's a two states divide into two different states, or two states combine into a different state. One of the ways in which you can create a state is called secession, meaning that a part of a state separates itself from an existing state to form a different one, right? And James Crawford, and I think correctly, argues that that is what happened with Israel. That you had, in my view, a Palestinian mandatory state, or in James Crawford's view, who did not think that Palestine was a state, a self-determination unit, so meaning an area that can become a state but isn't a state. And we can talk more about self-determination in a minute, that out of that state or self-determination unit, however you want to define it, one group of people, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, decided to secede from it and create a different state, separate from Palestine. That is why Israel did not really need to comply with the partition plan, because think about it in these terms. If Israel exists because of the application of the partition plan, then anything that Israel currently occupies in its internationally recognized borders, outside the borders of the 1948 partition plan Jewish state, all the rest would be illegally annexed under international law. Because Israel would have the borders of its 1948 state, right, the partition plan state, and then it expanded during the war of 1948 to its current borders, the so-called 1967 borders, right? Those borders would not be legal if Israel exists because of the partition plan. Those lands would be conquered, and in international law, you cannot conquer territory. Right, so those lands would be not Israeli, but yet we see a world where most states and even Palestine now says it's willing to negotiate on the basis of the 1967 lines. So what is up with that? So if Israel appeared as a result of secession, as opposed to as a result of the partition plan, then all of these problems vanish. Because Israel would not need to comply with the partition plan. It just went to a war of secession against Palestine, and created a separate entity within Palestine. Under the rules of secession, two things are very important. The first one is that the entity that secedes can only claim the territory as seceding territory that it effectively controls after the act of secession. So think of a famous secession, the Confederate States of America and the United States. They could only claim, when they seceded, the territory of those states that effectively seceded. They could not say that, I don't know, Maine was part of the territory of the Confederate States of America, because Maine did not secede, right? So you can only claim as a seceding entity the territory that secedes with you. Meaning that if you conceive Israel as a seceding entity, the borders of this proposed secessionist entity called Israel would be the borders that it managed to control at the end of its war of secession. Meaning the green line, the 1967 borders that we know today. Right? Are there international conventions for secession rules? Not conventions, but there is a lot of stuff being written about it, like in literature. So we do know what the rules of secession are, even if it's not regulated. There is a famous case on secession in Canada because Quebec was going to wanted to declare secession, and so the Canadian Supreme Court decided on whether Quebec had a right to secede or not, essentially determining that secession is a fact of life, a fact of international relations. It's not exactly something that can be described in legal or illegal terms. It's something that happens, and then whether it can be validated depends on the recognition of the host states and the international community, which is the second important thing that I was going to discuss with you. The first one being territory is all that you can get. The territory that you can get as a secessionist entity is only that territory that you are able to effectively control at the end of your secessionist war. The second one is whether or not your secession succeeds depends a lot on recognition. Right? So think, for example, in terms of Somalia. Somalia right now, country in the Horn of Africa, has a secessionist entity called Somaliland. Let me know what you want me to repeat, Cheryl, and I'll repeat it. But the general idea being that whether your secession will be recognized or not is very important. So think of Somalia. Somalia has this secessionist entity called Somaliland. It's in the northern tip of Somalia. It effectively operates as an independent state. It even issues passports, just no one recognizes those passports. Right. So can we say that Somaliland is a different state? Well, since Somalia doesn't recognize Somaliland independence, and no other state does, it is very difficult for you to argue that Somaliland has an effective way of engaging with the broader community. So it would not satisfy that requirement of being able to engage with others, right? Being able to have international relations. So Somaliland would be a non-recognized state. Right? Recently, Ethiopia signed a treaty with Somaliland, and everyone lost their minds and defended the territorial integrity of Somalia, which is how it usually happens. Usually, when a secessionist entity secedes, other states are very wary of recognizing, um, uh, a piece of territory that leaves another country. That's usually not a nice thing to do. When the Confederate States of America declared independence, the most that European powers did was recognize them belligerency, which meant that they acknowledged that they were a party to a civil war, but not an independent state. They were independent for the purposes of pursuing a war. But they were not a different state, because then the United States gets mad at you, and you sort of want to be able to trade with the United States and have good relations with the United States. Same with Somalia. Most states want to have a stable, unified Somalia, and so they don't want to recognize Somaliland. Is it possible for a state to eventually start getting recognition? Yes, that's literally what happened to Palestine, right? But recognition becomes super important. And unlike in the case of the United States, unlike the case of Somalia and Somaliland, Israel seceding from Palestine was immediately recognized. There's this famous quote that the United States took less than 10 minutes to recognize Israel as a seceding entity, and then many, many states in the course of from 1948 to 1949 recognized Israel, which is a unique scenario. Right? You have a seceding entity that is recognized almost immediately by states that don't recognize the host country as a state. It's a really weird situation. Jens says, "Don't want your territories to get ideas." Yeah, no state wants. There's a reason why, the Catalonia thing is so big in Spain, and states don't really want their territories to declare independence. In the case of Israel, this was very different. It's as if Somaliland had been already recognized by 160 countries worldwide as an independent state. That would give Somaliland some level of, international ability to engage internationally, and then we would be having a very different discussion about Somaliland, right? Um, and so normally these entities are not recognized because of a thing with self-determination that we can talk in a minute as well. Normally these entities are not recognized, but Israel was. So that sort of changes the dynamic, because that's why Israel was able to exist in the 40s and Palestine wasn't, because of this weird thing where it was recognized as an independent secessionist state. It usually doesn't happen. Israel should be in Somaliland's situation and Palestine should be in Somalia's situation, but it's sort of the other way around, which is weird. It doesn't happen anywhere else. Um, but so this reality, this understanding the origin of Israel as a secessionist state has important consequences. Because one of the big arguments by Israel is that because it is the only state that emerged from the mandate of Palestine, then it is the inheritor, the heir to the territorial claims of the mandate of Palestine. Iconoclast says, Palestine is recognized by more than 140 countries and has trade agreements with some. Is there a threshold for international recognition to force the Security Council into giving a seat to Palestine? So the amount of states that recognize you is useful, but it is not determinative. States exist independently of whether they are recognized or not. Right? So whether Somaliland is a state or not is not really dependent on its recognition as a state. But for practical purposes, recognition sort of matters for that state, whether existing or not, to be able to operate. So I would say that, definitely it helps to be recognized by so many states. But there is no actual threshold, because we don't want to say that a state only exists when they reach that threshold. Like when Peru declared its independence in 1821, Peru, my state, no one recognized it. And yet we count its moment of birth in 1821. We don't want to say, oh, but Spain didn't recognize Peru until 1840 something, therefore Peru was not a state. We don't want to do that, because we want to recognize that, people have a right to self-determination. So there is no threshold, but certainly recognition helps. Right. So, can we force the Security Council into giving a seat to Palestine? You can engage in diplomacy and create international pressure for this, but it is tricky when the United States holds a veto. So that's something that we might need to change the dynamics of the debate before that is something that happens in practice. Now, you don't really need to be recognized by the UN to count as a state. There have been non-member states of the UN that are clearly states, right? The most famous being Austria, for a while. Now it is. If you're a non-member state, you can still be a state, to the point where Palestine right now is an observer state of the United Nations, meaning it's not a member, but it is recognized as a state, right? So, but going back to the issue of secession, of Israeli secession, why is it important? Well, like I was saying, you're welcome, Iconoclast. When Israel declared independence, as time went by, it started to become their argument that as the only state to emerge out of the Palestinian mandate, then they were the inheritors of the Palestinian mandate's borders. This is a principle that is called uti possidetis iuris. It's a Latin phrase, and it originally comes from Latin American independence in the 19th century. It basically says that the colonial borders become the international borders of the independent colony. So the Viceroyalty of Peru had borders, and the Captaincy of Chile had borders within the Spanish Empire. The borders of the Viceroyalty of Peru become the borders of the Republic of Peru, and the borders of the Captaincy of Chile become the borders of the Republic of Chile. Right? So the general idea being that borders are stable. Now, this is a principle that is tricky to apply because it is a principle that is based on Western concepts and Western law. So, for example, indigenous people and their borders are completely ignored from the concept of utiposidetis. So, for example, in the border between Venezuela and Brazil, there's an indigenous community called the Yanomami. The Yanomami did not benefit from utiposidetis because utiposidetis only applies to sovereign nation states, Brazil and Venezuela. Right, so their territory is sandwiched between Brazil and Venezuela, and so one chunk of it is subjected to Venezuelan law, one chunk of it is subjected to Brazilian law. So it is not a perfect system at all. Utiposidetis. It is still part of this like colonial mindset of international law. SV 5679. I'll get to that. Give me 1 second, then I'll get to that. So upon the independence of Israel, they claim that then utiposidetis, this principle that says the colonial borders become the final borders, should be applied to Israel. What does this mean? It means that Israel should be the inheritor of the entire mandate of Palestine, all of it, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the current borders of Israel, which is not really does not really make sense within the theory of secession. It might make sense to in other interpretations, not ones that I subscribe to. But it doesn't in the case of secession. Why? Because if you secede from Palestine, then the people that declared independence was the ones represented by the Jewish Agency for Palestine, meaning not every community of mandatory Palestine, just the Jewish communities. So you cannot claim then the territory of all of Palestine. You can only claim the territory that you were able to control in your secessionist war, 1967 borders. Right? So it is important to conclude that if you conclude that Israel is a result of secession, then the argument that the entire West Bank is territory of Israel because of utiposidetis, because it should inherit the borders of the entire mandate, becomes impossible. Because there is no equivalent to the Jewish state in a colonial border. The partition plan was never implemented, right? So there's no Jewish state borders that are equivalent to, say, the Viceroyalty of Peru, right? The Viceroyalty of Peru is not the equivalent to the partition plan. That is different. The partition plan was never implemented. It was proposed through a UN General Assembly resolution. And so it's not how can I say this? It's not a binding plan that had to be applied. It needed to be implemented by the resulting states. And as we discussed in the beginning, Israel did not implement it, and Palestine did not accept it. Right? So utiposidetis sort of collapses on this, because then it means that what became independent wasn't Palestine. The mandate of Palestine did not declare independence from the British Empire. The Jewish Agency for Palestine declared independence from Palestine. That's the key. So that means that Israel does not have a claim to the West Bank. This is something that was very much discussed in the recent ICJ advisory opinion. Judge Sebutinde, the judge that dissented from the opinion, very openly said that yes, that Israel should have a right to claim and dispute the the utiposidetis principle, and have a claim to the West Bank. This is something that the secession theory negates, essentially. So this is why I think it's important to understand where Israel comes from, because then it means that this claim of sovereignty over the entire territory of Palestine no longer makes sense. Okay, something's going on in the chat. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Oh, okay. So there's there's spam. Um, anyway, I'm eventually will be able to get rid of these things. Okay, so joint late maybe has already been addressed. Isn't the actual most important point the one of state power if it comes to Palestine as a state? Uh, yeah, we did talk about whether we should have this like very legalistic concept of states. This is a question by Choam Nomsky, and my position is that you shouldn't. That you shouldn't have a very legalistic position on state because the creation of states is just both political and legal. So um, I have a much more flexible approach. But anyway, but we are at the position of secession. So here's where we come to SV 5679's position of wouldn't this mean that every Palestinian is a citizen of Israel under that theory? And yeah, if Israel were to claim the entire territory of the West Bank, then it doesn't make sense that Israel is occupying the West Bank. If what happened was that Israel was recovering territory that it claims when it occupied it, then it shouldn't have occupied it. If it's subjected to an occupation, then it is by definition not yours. Like, how do you occupy your own territory? So this is there are very common internal contradictions in the expansionist interpretation of Israeli sovereignty that include in occupying your own territory apparently. Whereas if you understand it in the way that I am understanding it, there's less internal contradiction because then Israel would be a secessionist entity and would not have a right to otiposidetis. Right? Let me see. Oh yes, thank you, Cheryl. I will, like I said at the beginning to Chomnomsky, I will after 7 days I will upload these on YouTube. Right. So before I move on, I just want to make sure that everyone's like with me and there are no other questions. Does anyone have any questions? Hello. Some professors I follow. This is Flavia Pantoja, who previously believed that the only way to peace was a two-state solution, now are saying that they do not believe it possible anymore after October 7th. They now think that the way to peace and stability is a binational state. What do you think, and can you elaborate on it? Definitions? Okay. Yes, thank you, Flavia. That is a great question. So, I was never I'm not going to say that I was never a fan, but like I've never been very much convinced that the two-state solution is implementable for a very simple reason. Creating states is the bread and butter of international law. Usually we understand the concept of international law as that thing that states create. Right? States create international law to solve their disputes. But in very real ways, it is international law itself that defines who is a state and who is worthy of receiving this sovereign, title of quote unquote a state. And that is not a very pretty history. And this has to do a lot with my broader research on the concept of the state. Okay, and let me take you back again to the aftermath of World War I, where the League of Nations was created through the Covenant of the League of Nations, and there were two states that were members of the League of Nations that had not been included in the mandate system because they were independent themselves. They had not been part of any other empire or a colony or something. They were independent. Ethiopia, at that time called Abyssinia, and Liberia. And there is an excellent book by a scholar called Adam Getachew. It's called World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, that studies this idea of how these non-Western communities were incorporated into the Western world order of states. Okay, and her argument is that they weren't, because membership in the international community, when you belong to one of these categories that are defined as like semi or less civilized than Europeans because the Western canon is considered superior, then membership becomes burdened. Burdened membership leads to not real sovereignty. And so Ethiopia, for example, was from very early on criticized within the League of Nations because they said, "Oh, this country has backward laws," and so in the hinterlands of the territory, deep into Ethiopian territory, there's still slavery, and we as like developed Europeans cannot allow this, which was very ironic considering what had just happened in the Belgian Congo, right? And what was still happening all around the colonies of European powers in Africa, where slavery was very much still a thing. It was just, ignored. And so Ethiopia was subjected to international oversight as by the League of Nations to establish conditions so that it would be able to join the civilized nations, quote unquote, and join, the civilized world and end slavery. And so its own independence, its own membership was burdened and limited because it was conceived, represented, and seen and imagined as less civilized than the West. And eventually, Italy, fascist Italy in 1935, used this idea of Ethiopia not being, quote unquote, civilized enough to end slavery as its excuse to invade Ethiopia in 1935, before World War II. Said Ethiopia has not complied with its legal obligations to the League, therefore we will go in and, quote unquote, end slavery and along the way just colonize Ethiopia. So who gets to be called a state and who doesn't is very much a thing in international law. And it is not a nice history. Not everyone gets to. And so when we discuss two states in the context of Israel and Palestine, this is exactly what I see. How does Palestine get to be called a state in the two-state solution? As it exists right now, if you see Donald Trump's latest peace proposal by the Trump administration, it is also a burdened membership. Most peace treaties that have been put on the table for Palestine to accept, all of these Palestine never says yes to peace deals. Well, it is because what is proposed for Palestine is a very burdened membership, just like Ethiopia, just like Liberia. It is a country that doesn't have control over its own borders. It is a country where security is managed by Israel, like national security would be allotted to Israel, where its refugees all over the world would not have the right to return to their former lands, and where it would be up to Israel to decide when is Palestine ready to join international community as a full membered state. So it is another sort of mandate. And this is what is at the heart of the Palestinians already went through the Oslo Treaty as a treaty that normalized occupation. As a situation, you went from a situation where you were resisting occupation to a situation where you were in a normalized occupation, legalized through the Oslo Agreement. It is the new normal. We no longer think, until at least the ICJ opinion, but we didn't think of the occupation anymore as something that needed to end immediately. Those who did were just the radical position, right? Most just said, well, it's what it is. It's a reality of war. It's occupied. Because it was normalized. And so Palestinians, understandably, don't want to normalize burdened statehood. They want an actual state. And they should get one. Right? Sally Panic says, read Ethiopia. They did not teach this stuff to me in high school in the 70s. Well, they didn't teach it to me in the 90s, and they didn't teach it to me in college in the 2000s, so don't worry about it. But you really should read Getachew's book. It is fantastic. I highly recommend it. Another author that you can read on this is Rose Parfit. Also really good stuff on this. Hola, profe. Oh, okay. Who's I think a former student of mine is here. But Auswind. Hi. Welcome. Link that book on X or something. I will. I think I can actually send the link through chat, right? I think I can chat myself. Uh, I don't know how to chat. Chat. Uh, oh, I need to log in. I'll do it later. I'll do it later. I didn't know that I had to log into my own chat. Um, let me see if I can do it here. Chat. Oh, there you go. Ha! I'm able to do it. Okay, so, um, where was I? Oh, right, the two-state solution. So, when we talk about the two-state solution, it is very important to consider if it's really a two-state solution. Is this burdened Palestine without a military, demilitarized, without full control of borders, without control of national security? Um, is that really a state? And or is it a full state at least? And does that not sound like another mandatory system like situation where Palestinian people will be again restricted in their rights? And then people will say, but they already have their state and they're still complaining. Oh, they're never happy, right? So that is my main problem with the two-state solution as it is currently understood. Okay, I had to learn Italy invaded Ethiopia from Hearts of Iron. That's one of the games that we can play in this feed actually. So okay, but so is the two-state solution then really a two-state solution, or is it a 1.5-state solution? This is why it is so important for other states to continue to recognize Palestine, because if you look at the reasoning of the ICJ's advisory opinion recently, essentially what they're saying is to remedy the harm caused by Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, it needs to lift the occupation, dismantle the settlements, and recognize the Palestinian state. And then negotiate. And then negotiate. That is a much more attractive framework for Palestinians than the burdened two-state solution of old. Right? First, you're a state, then you negotiate as an equal. What are the terms for, the accommodations that will come about? First, you remove all the illegal stuff, and then you negotiate. So yeah, I am not a fan of this version of the two-state solution. It is, like I said in the previous stream, it is not up to me to decide how Palestinians and Israelis resolve their conflict. They need to come with a solution that leaves them happy. If that solution is two states, then two states it is. I do think, though, from the perspective of someone who studies the concept of a state, I do think that it is important that the state that we produce is a fair one. Because there's this constant idea of peace as the ultimate objective in the Middle East, right? Or we need to achieve peace. But I'm sorry, peace can suck. There is such a thing as an unjust peace. There is such a thing as a violent peace. There is such a thing as a restrictive and oppressive peace, which is what usually exists. When people say history did not start in October 7th, and there was like this idea that there was a ceasefire before October 7th, it was a very violent ceasefire. It was a very aggressive and oppressive ceasefire that the ICJ has recently called apartheid, systematic discrimination, annexation, and racial segregation. That was peace, quote unquote. So I don't think we should focus on peace as the overarching, criteria. I think we should focus on justice as the overarching criteria. Will we have justice in that proposed two-state solution? And as proposed, I don't think we will. So, my preferred solution, like I said in the previous stream, is what you would describe as a one-state solution. Not necessarily because of any kind of study of Israeli-Palestinian context, but because I apply to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the same rules that I apply to any other area that I am seeking to decolonize. Let me see the questions. Hold on. Is there any merit to Palestine willingly being annexed by an ally, say Iran, then spun off or secede as an independent state? I mean, it sounds very convoluted to achieve the same result. This is a question by GT Floptimal. Jens says, I would also still maintain that it was war on the admittedly technicality that Israel is actively blockading Gaza. Yes, of course. Like when I say peace, I don't mean it in the legal term peace as opposed to war, but in the sense of like, what do you call it, negative peace in the absence of, actual kinetic attacks or anything like that. But yes, technically speaking, war. It is. Jens says it is a very legalistic hobby pet peeve. Yes, you are technically right. And if I could include memes here, I would put that Futurama meme of like you are technically right. You are technically correct. The best type of correct. Um, the line between peace and justice is very thin, says Flavia Pantoja. It is. But I just think it is a very important one in the context that we're discussing. Sally Panic says this idea of peace is Palestinian. If idea of peace is Palestinian subjugation, continued apartheid. So no. Yeah, exactly. There is such a thing as an unjust apartheid peace, right? Rasinov, is the modern state of Palestine claiming in any way successorship to the mandate? Oh, this is a very good question. So there's a lot of debate of what exactly is the claim here, because there's the 1988 Palestinian Declaration of Independence. So there is an argument to say no, the state of Palestine only claims the borders of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and that's it. But when you read the Declaration of Independence itself, it is a lot more nuanced and detailed than that. So Palestinians call their Declaration of Independence their historic compromise. What is the historic compromise of Palestine? It's the idea, as of 1988, that they are for the first time willing to engage with the idea of partition, meaning that they are willing for the first time to recognize that Israel can exist in 1967 borders, and they would be okay with getting 1967 borders for themselves. Before that, Palestine said, no, Palestine is Palestine. Israel is, partitioning our land without our consent. We don't want that. We want the binational state, if you will. We want Palestine to continue to be an Arab majority country with a Jewish minority where rights are respected, as it was during Ottoman times, and etc. etc. Right. So, but in 1988, with the Declaration of Independence, what the PLO says is, we will be willing to entertain the notion of partition. They don't exactly say that is it. They speak in very general terms. But that is the general idea, that it will be possible to find peace through partition. That is the first time that it happens. So I do think that the 1988 Declaration of Independence is more on the lines of saying, we are willing to engage with you on this. And so by doing so, sort of proving that, yeah, the original claim of the state of Palestine is to the territory of all of Palestine, and it is willing to cede to Israel the land that Israel took in 1948-49. Essentially, think of the Somaliland example again. Right? It's as if Somalia came out and said, okay, Somaliland, you know what? I am willing to entertain partition as the principle for solving our differences, and I'm willing to cede to you the territory of Somaliland in exchange for peace. That's what Palestine did in 1988. Which means that before 1988, yes, it was claiming all of the territory, and arguably, until they sit down and actually agree to this, it still claims the whole of Palestine as a territory. This is why this, when you see those T-shirts or stickers of, watermelon-shaped Palestine, I don't think that is in any way offensive. Like, Yes, of course, under the Palestinian way of looking at the history, until Israel and Palestine sit down at a negotiation table, the Palestinian claim is Palestine, Israel seceded, and so we need to agree on terms so that we can finally grant legitimacy to that secessionist territory of Israel. So until I say so, would say Palestine, your territory is sort of like not an international border. It's an armistice land, famously an armistice land as a result of the 1948-49, the 48-49 War of Independence. So if it's not a border yet, because I haven't signed up for it, then then of course the Palestinian claim would be to the whole territory. That doesn't mean that Palestine is saying that it wants in any way to genocide Israelis or expel all the Jews from Palestine. Just from the legal, logical outcome of the Palestinian understanding of its own statehood, that's the map until they negotiate something differently. So yeah, I think for historical reasons, that is how I would read it, right? Okay, so what else? Let me see more questions. Martin Luther King said, "Our greatest stumbling block is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Yes, this is a thank you, SV5679. This is a very famous quote from a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King. I agree with it. I fundamentally agree with it. Okay. Let me see. Where were we? Oh yeah, the binational state, right? We were talking about the two. So the two-state solution is no longer possible, or maybe never was. What is the alternative, right? So, like I said in the previous stream, I personally, without wanting to impose this on Israelis or Palestinians, I favor a sort of one-state solution, because this is what I would favor for any community that wants to decolonize. I see in the main problem here is nation statehood. Right? And this is, someone asked me about this in the beginning, so this is a good time to bring it up. To me, the main problem with international world order is the fact that we have created a vision of state, the Westphalian nation state, that is premised on constructing one nation. The France for the French, right? And yesterday, the day before that, the Olympics inauguration, they purport to represent, Frenchhood, right? Yeah, I completely agree that that's up to Palestinians to decide. Sally Panic. Sorry, Cheryl Benson. Yeah, I do think it's for them to decide. So where was I? I lost my train of thought. Oh, right. We have constructed this idea of the nation as this uniform thing. This is what French culture looks like. Here, we're going to put it in the TV in front of you so that you see what French culture looks like in the Olympics, right? It is a culturally uniform country. Whoever doesn't subscribe to that is not really French. Yes, Westphalian state was the topic. Thank you. And so, for example, this is how Denmark, for example, there's the very troubling law in Denmark that says that when you immigrate into Denmark from outside of Europe, or I think outside of the Western world, you need to take classes on how to become Danish, and they teach you, what it is like to be Danish, which is highly problematic in my view, because the very idea that there is such a thing as a constant through time and uniform idea of Danishness sort of leaves people on the edges of society, and you call them minority. Even the term itself is sort of problematic. The idea that there's such a thing as a minority. There's a majority, and remember, we live in democracies, so majority has the rights, um, and you have some minorities, meaning that they don't decide, right? This is a very big problem for me in the concept of how we've defined a state. Because so how do you approach the creation of this nation? That's Zionism. Yeah, I mean, Zionism is a nationalist movement. It's Jewish nationalism. What they're saying is this is what it means to be um, Jewish as a nationality, right? So this is a very big problem because then the people that are at the edges, take for example my own country, Peru. Indigenous people in Peru are not part of this community, this society that is called the Peruvian nation, right? Because the Peruvian nation is defined as the mixture of Spanish and indigenous. So if you're purely indigenous, if you define yourself as purely indigenous, you're not part of the nation. You are a citizen. But if you live on top of natural resources, you're in the way. The nation needs the resources. So of course you need to be relocated, moved away so that we can get the resources for the Peruvian nation. So that is a very problematic way of understanding how societies work. Most countries in the world are not like this. Look at Belgium, Walloons and Flemish. Look at the United Kingdom, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, English. Look at Switzerland. So concepts of nation are much more complex than a nation state. And if you define the nation as this culturally uniform thing, then you will necessarily be leaving people on the edges, discriminating them, oppressing them, or worse, genociding them and doing horrible things. Right? So that is to me the main problem with the nation state. So my proposal to decolonize the idea of the nation state, my proposal and that of many others, of course, I didn't invent this. This is decolonial theory, is to say, particularly in Latin America, we need a more complex idea of nationhood. This happened, for example, during the recent constitutional referendum in Chile. Um, Chile is a country that has genocided a lot of indigenous populations, and it doesn't really recognize indigenous communities to any significant degree. In fact, there's a very big problem because the anti-terrorism law in Chile is essentially designed to catalog Mapuche resistance as terrorism. And so one of the main constitutional reforms that the new constitution proposed was to establish Chile as a more complex nation. It was called the plurinational nation. Under plurinationality, thanks for following, Piero Giburo. Under plurinationality, all of these indigenous communities would still form part of a Chilean nation, but we would understand that the creation of this more complex Chilean nation involves them, includes them, that they need specific national protections. Just like in Belgium, you can speak French or Flemish, you should be able to speak Mapuche in Chile, and you should be able to have congressional representation as a Mapuche, and your culture should be protected. Your culture should be taught in school, and you should be able to get government documents in your language and things like that. And so, and if in your territory they find some valuable mineral, that doesn't mean that you can just be moved away, right? So you need to conceive nationhood as more complex without destroying, Chileanness. You need to accept that Chileans come in all forms and shapes and sizes in terms of nationhood. Not every people has had the same experience, and we need to address that in our concept of nationhood, right? So that is the trick. So I would bring these minorities to the center, and that is exactly what I feel should happen when you have two populations in Israel-Palestine that needs to coexist. You need a plurinational concept of state, where Israelis, Palestinians, Jewish and Arab, Muslim, and Jewish can all live in coexistence in a state that recognizes the complexity of its nationhood. Because if you separate them into one, someone asks here if I believe that Lola Niles Lola asked if I believe that Israel is an ethno state, and I think many states attempt to be ethno states. Israel, one of them. But then the whole premise of the two-state solution is let's create two ethno states, one Jewish, one Arab Muslim, right? Um, and which is why the right of return suddenly becomes complicated, because if you import a large population that is not Jewish into the Jewish ethno state, then it stops being Jewish. So this identity idea as the Jewish state, the Arab state, embedded in partition, is very colonial in nature. It reinforces the idea of the Westphalian nation state. I think we should move away from it. I think we should move to a situation where you can have indigenous people, Arab Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians or Jewish Israelis living as one single state where their national rights are protected at the constitutional level, and you can come up with the most creative solutions for this. You can have a confederacy, you can have a federal state, you can create your own state if you want. We need to go back to a time where when states were weird. States used to be really weird. Austria-Hungary was super weird. Austria was an independent state, but its foreign relations was assigned to Austria, which was basically the seat of the crown for the Habsburg Empire. That was super weird. We need to go back to that time, because in the weirdness is where you can accommodate different ways of social organization and political organization. Yes, hashtag make states weird again. I like that. Because if we all have this cookie cutter concept of a state, and they're all like super Westphalian nation states, people fall through the cracks. And this happens everywhere. This happens with every state. There's people from all kinds of, every part of the world here. Think of your state. Who do you conceive of as a minority? And think of whether that minority has problems or not in your state. Chances are they do. In Peru, indigenous peoples are conceived as minority. They have a lot of problems with protesting right now for better recognition of rights. Lola is from Argentina. In Argentina as well, there was a huge problem in Argentina with how the nation was conceived, so that it was, I mean, in Spanish we say blanqueamiento de la raza, the whitening of the race, right, quote unquote race, and so Afro-Argentinians were displaced and indigenous Argentinians were displaced. And so the concept of an Argentinian is now essentially like the descendants of Italian immigrants and, Spanish colonialists living in Argentina. And it's become a very uniform identity of the white Argentinian. And the minorities are excluded. But they exist. And so I would propose the same kind of arrangement for Israel-Palestine. One state where, with a complex concept of nationality, where, not nationality, of nationhood, where Israelis and Palestinians can have their national rights protected at the state level, but where you exactly draw the line between Israel and Palestine doesn't really matter. We really need to stop seeing the world as a map where you get to decide where you can draw the line so that this is mine and that is yours. Look at Northern Ireland. Huge conflict. Solved by removing a line. Borders are violent. Hashtag borders are violent. Right? So the softer the border, or the less borders we have, the better for a decolonial future. So Iconoclast says it's an argument from anti-Palestinians that Palestine is not a state because it never existed in a globally accepted structure. Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, at least in my view, where I think that the Palestinian state existed since at least 1922, Palestine as a state appeared before the Permanent Court of International Justice in the Mavromatis case. You can search that. It is a case dealing with concessions issued by the Ottomans that the Greek investors wanted the British administration to recognize as, investment in Palestine. So Palestine existed there. There were a lot of problems in the 1920s with who inherits Ottoman debts. Right? And there were a lot of arbitrations to see who inherits Ottoman debt. Is this debt valid and therefore should be paid by Palestine or not? And the debt was not ascribed to the UK because the UK was not the colonial, quote unquote, the colonial master of Palestine. It was ascribed to Palestine as an independent entity. So Palestine has appeared in international tribunals. It's had an internationally recognized passport. Um, and more importantly, now it's recognized by 148 states. Right? It is a lot of recognition. So I don't think that you can say that it's never existed in a globally accepted structure. It is even an observer state of the UN, the main global structure. Right? Um, so I think that's a very weak argument to claim that Palestine doesn't have, isn't globally accepted. Like the number of states that recognize Palestine and the number of states that recognize Israel is not that different. I think Israel is at 160 something, and Palestine is at 140 something. It's not that much. Chomnomsky says insolvency law leading to recognition of states has some kind of irony to it. Yeah, it does. There's a really excellent book if you want to read more about this by John Quigley. It's called the Statehood of Palestine. Let me send you the link. Here it is. It is a really good book if you wanna read about these cases. Okay. Then Flavia Pantoja says, Brazil. Oh, Flavia, is it you're Brazilian? So it's Flavia Pantoja. Brazil here and our awful track record with our indigenous population. Yes, Brazil has both Brazil and Peru have very difficult histories with colonialism, internal colonialism towards indigenous people. Any other recommendations would be gratefully received. Less Trump. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna try to do this more often. Like, if while I'm talking, if there's any book that I think you guys can benefit from reading, I'll do that. Um, I mean, I don't know if there's a more efficient way of doing this, but yeah, I don't know if I can put the document somewhere in the Twitch page and you guys can access it. Um, Lola says Chomsky and Pape. Chomsky, of course, very very well known, but Pape is an Israeli historian, Ilan Pape, who wrote a book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Both agree on the two-state solution not being much of a solution, too. But to me, a one-state solution is impossible insofar as neither party would accept living under the other as states. What do you call this new state? How do you please both? Hard to imagine the outlines it would take. Well, again, I'm not saying a one-state solution can happen overnight. To get there, we would need like a very long process. I'm talking like years, if not decades long, of painful negotiations, but with that as a goal, the establishment of a single state as opposed to two states. And I think it becomes more palatable when you stop conceiving the world as a map with lines. Again, this is a huge pet peeve of mine. The world should not be seen as a map where you draw lines to determine ownership of land. The world should focus on the rights of the people that live on that land. And I really don't care where you draw lines. Again, Northern Ireland, Belgium, excellent examples of countries that have complex nationhoods and still are able to respect the rights of very different people that sometimes don't like each other. So if you don't conceive states as maps with lines, and you stop really caring which part is Jewish, which part is Palestinian, and you start focusing on, do Jewish people have a right to pray at the Temple Wall? Yes. Do Palestinians have a right to go to Al-Aqsa Mosque? Yes. Should Damascus Gate be reserved for Israelis? No. Should Palestinians be allowed into settlements in the West Bank? Of course. They should not be settlements. They should be removed, and the area should be cultivated, for both nations of Israel Palestine. This is something that came up during the Palestinian mandate. As late as 1935, there was a 1939, no, 35. There was a white paper in 1935, I think, by the British administration, where they discussed whether, because the mandate of Palestine had been charged with establishing a, quote, national home for Palestinian people. And so the British were discussing amongst themselves, what does this national home mean? What can it mean? Does it mean a state? And they reasoned that if you were to turn this into a nation state, two nation states, there would be a lot of violence, and it would not be accepted as a solution. And the very nation that you were trying to establish in Palestine would suffer the consequences. Sort of what's happened in the real world. And so they concluded that the idea of the national home of Jewish people was not necessarily a state. It was an entity, a group of social organization within Palestine, and that the creation of that nation had already been successful, that nation already existed, and it needed to be protected. That's where I would focus. I would focus on self-determination as a right, the right of Jewish citizens and Arab citizens and Muslim citizens to be able to live their lives in peace without worrying whether they crossed a checkpoint or not. So when you move beyond the map, the solution isn't as unthinkable. But of course, going beyond the map requires a lot of deconstruction of our own, preconceptions of what states mean. And of course, it does require, if not the dismantling of the Zionist ideal, at least a very heavy reconstruction. In the lines of the 1935 white paper. Let me see if I can find you the white paper and send it to you. I think I can. It should be. Yeah, here it is. So it's the 1939 British white paper. I'm going to put it on the chat for you to read. I find this document so illuminating. You should definitely read it. And it talks about how the Palestinian, the Jewish nation within Palestine exists, and it has national components. So it says in section 1, it says, it has been urged that the expression, a national home for the Jewish people, I'm reading, offered a prospect that Palestine might in due course become a Jewish state or commonwealth. His Majesty's government do not wish to contest the view which was expressed by the Royal Commission that the Zionist leaders at the time of the issue of the Balfour Declaration recognized that an ultimate Jewish state was not precluded by the terms of the declaration. But, with the Royal Commission, His Majesty's government believed that the framers of the mandate in which the Balfour Declaration was embodied could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. Palestine was not to be converted into a Jewish state. That Palestine was not to be converted into a Jewish state might be held to be implied in the passage of the blah 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 blah. And it goes on to say, the disappearance of or the subordination of the Arabic population, language, or culture in Palestine is not good. It instead talks about how an already national home has already been established in Palestine. It says, during the last 2 or 3 generations, the Jews have recreated in Palestine a community of numbering 80,000, of whom about 1/4 are farmers or workers upon the land. The community has its own political organs, an elected assembly for the direction of its domestic concerns, elected councils in the towns, and an organization for the control of its schools. This community, then, with its town and country and population, this community then, with its town and country population, its political, religious, and social organizations, its own language, its own customs, its own life, has in fact national characteristics. This is 1939. It was already being recognized as a national home outside the concept of a Westphalian nation state. And yet somehow in 2024, this is unthinkable. If 1939 colonial minds could think this way, then we can find an even better way of securing this one-state solution that, that keeps self-determination at its core as the main value, that people living in this land should be free to live in this land however they want. And not so much, where exactly do we draw this awful line that creates so much problems for everyone. Okay, while I was reading, there's a lot of questions. Julie77A says, but indigenous populations are not considered lesser citizens by law, are they? In Israel, the state at the state level discriminates against non-Jews. Well, okay, so we don't have an equivalent in Peru. We don't have an equivalent of the Jewish nation state law, for example. But indigenous populations were discriminated in very real ways, in very different ways. Say, for example, take Peru. Peru existed in a state of feudalism, literally feudalism, where like large landowners bought and sold land that came with people in it, that came with people in it to work the land. If you sold the property, it came with people. That's feudalism. We had that system until 1969. And then people in Peru could not vote if they could not read or write in Spanish, the official language of the country. Who could not read or write in Spanish in Peru in the 1960s? Indigenous people. When did we change this law? 1979. Peru didn't have universal voting until 1979. We had the female vote in 1955, but the indigenous vote in 1979. It's really bad. And there are other laws that continue to this day, including like Natural Resources Organization. So yes, we don't have a specific regime that says indigenous people are inferior. In fact, we have, or not represented by the nation. We have laws that aim at protecting the interest of indigenous people. But they are laws that are premised under the idea that indigenous peoples are minorities and therefore have less relevance. For example, if there's natural resources in indigenous land, they get to be consulted, but they don't get to veto the state getting the natural resources underneath their land, right? So yeah, it's not the same, but the situation with decolonization of like Peru, for example, is not that dissimilar from Palestine. This is why this idea that that I dislike, that Israel is treated to a different standard, at least not by me. The reason why I believe the way I believe about Israel-Palestine is because that's what I believe for every single country that exists in a colonial structure, and I would say every single country, in the sense that every single country is a Westphalian nation state, meaning one nation for one state, and minorities they're sprinkled around, is colonial in nature. So I'm really not treating Israel to a different standard. What else? Flavia, you mentioned another book, The Rise and Fall of Western Civilization. Can you confirm the author, please? I don't know that I mentioned The Rise and Fall of Western Civilizations. I'm not sure what that one is. I'm sorry. I've recommended Adam Getachew's book here, and I've mentioned the 1935 white paper, and also John Quigley's The State of Palestine. All of them are in the chat. Julie says, but is it written anywhere that indigenous people will never be legit Peruvians? Because living in Israel, I feel that my Arab friends will never be welcome regardless of the fact that they've been here for decades, if not centuries. No. There's nowhere written that indigenous peoples are not legit Peruvians. But there is a very powerful discourse on that line. There's a very famous, in 2009 there was a large 2010 there was a large indigenous demonstration in Peru against a law that sought to make it easier to sell indigenous land, and indigenous people declared themselves an insurrection, and they marched to the cities to protest. Indigenous people from the Amazon, and a very famous TV commentator, Mariela Balbi, this is irrelevant, her name is irrelevant, but said, the country cannot stop just because you have a problem. The country cannot stop just because indigenous people from the Amazon have a problem. That's sort of like the way in which indigenous people are not really considered part of the nation, because we have bigger problems than your well-being. So Chomnomsky says, maybe you referred to world making after... Yeah, that's the Adam Gedachew's book that I was recommending. Yeah, that's the one. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions that you may want answered? Um, Let me go up the chat and see if there's anything that I might have missed. Um, Sally says, Sally Panic. Zionism wants both an ethno state and a democracy. That's impossible, mutually exclusive. Like an oxymoron in a one state that won't fly. I mean, it is impossible, but I would say again, it's a problem that affects countries beyond Israel. Because the idea of the nation state, insofar as it warrants cultural uniformity, tends to exclude people that don't subscribe to that definition of nation. That's why indigenous people in Peru couldn't vote, for example. So yes, Zionism wants an ethno state and a democracy. That is a staple of colonialist viewpoints, and because Zionism is a colonialist endeavor, basically. So yeah, I agree with that. Um, okay, so let me see if I missed anything. Uh, okay, I think I've answered everyone's questions. Okay, so to start wrapping things up, because we've been talking for an hour and 45 minutes. Um, Essentially, can you sketch out how you think the next 20 years will go in Palestine? Less Strumpf answers. Maybe a best case scenario and a more grounded, realistic version. Oh, that's a very interesting question. Okay, so um, making predictions about Israel Palestine is not easy. Okay, so I might be very wrong. Um, my so I would say okay. Uh, I need to be very careful uh, not to confuse what I would want to happen from what I think can happen. Okay, so because right now I think what we will be closest to achieving um, is very little. Like other than the continuation of the status quo, right now as things stand in the current world order and everything, where we might move, based on what, say, the new British government is saying, is to a renewed set of negotiations, particularly if, say, Kamala Harris wins in the United States, with a view to creating a new proposal for a new two-state solution-based peace agreement that will have all the problems that I told you a second ago that I think the two-state solution has, with its burdened membership, Ethiopia-style statehood. Right. Um, so that's what I think we're closest to. I think that's what the UK and the US might eventually conceivably be ready to accept as more of its allies recognize Palestine. You have Norway, Spain, Slovenia um, recognizing Palestine, and that creates pressure. So there will be pressure to just sit people down in a table and come to solutions. Do I think that that would solve the conflict? Definitely not. I think it would just create a new normal, and in that new normal, there would be other problems, and Israel would still be in control of security, so there would still be a lot of war and aggression and problems, right? And with the added problem of people then saying, "What more do you want?" This is a recurrent problem with negotiations with indigenous people in Latin America. You give them something that's very insufficient to compensate for long-standing harm, and when that doesn't remedy the situation, they feel scammed and they protest again, and the reaction by the company or the state or whatever is, what else do you want? And I feel that's something that could happen with Palestine. Like, what else do you want? We already gave you a state. What else do you want? Or we already gave you a new Oslo. What more do you want? And I think that's a very real danger. So personally, I think as things stand, I value the longer arc that the Palestinian Liberation Organization is, weaving, is setting up. This started a long time ago. I still remember when I was in college, and the big news was Palestine is trying to accede to the ICC Rome Statute, and it was such a crazy thing. Like, what? But are they a state? Are they not a state? Was this going to happen or not? And now we're discussing arrest warrants for Netanyahu, right? So I value this engagement with the colonial rules of international law so that they can be used for the fostering of anti-colonial goals in the mid to long term. And in the mid to long term, if I am optimistic, if I tell you what I hope would happen, is that we would be able to move beyond this idea of the state as a map with lines, and move towards a more, decolonized solution for Israel-Palestine. Am I hopeful that that will happen? Not now, but maybe if world order continues to change in the direction that it's changing now, it might be. But I wouldn't bet on it. I am whatever happens, it will take time. And I think we need to be mindful of that the battles that we're winning for the longer term. Unfortunately, Israel has the backing of the world's superpower, so it's very difficult to get it to do anything else. The How have the Abraham Accords changed things? I feel like Arab countries are recognizing the reality that Israelis and Palestinians have been there for 60 plus years and are not going anywhere, and recognize both countries, while Western countries seem unreasonable to not recognize Palestine. Yes, the Abraham Accords, for those who don't know, are the treaties promoted by the Trump administration to normalize the relationship between Arab states and Israel. And the big kahuna here is Saudi Arabia. Will Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel? And I think October 7th and the reaction to October 7th has tempered the excitement for the Abraham Accords, because uh, it's become one of the things that one of the strategic defeats that Israel has had in the last 9 months is that for the past 40 years, it has been operating, well, 20 if you only count Gaza, it has been operating under the dynamic where every few years it bombs Gaza and then mows the lawn, quote unquote, and then it it withdraws its forces and the show continues. And that's the normalized thing about Gaza. Just like the occupation is the normalized West Bank, mowing the lawn is the normalized Gaza. And I think its reaction to October 7th has destroyed that. I don't think anyone will accept that going forward. No one will accept that Israel has a right to attack Gaza every few years anymore. And the show cannot go on. The show needs to end, and it needs to stop. And I think this is a very important thing to bring the Abraham Accords to a pause. Saudi Arabia is saying we will not sign these without a fully recognized Palestinian state, for example. So I think the trend of normalizing relations has softened, has paused a little bit. Then Iconoclast, if Palestinians end up with a two-state solution, can they be forced to be demilitarized to accommodate Israel's security concerns? So that's my problem with the two-state solution, right? Because you wouldn't call it being forced to decolonize. You would call them signing a treaty and accepting this limitation on their sovereignty, which is perfectly valid. You can do it. It's just I don't think it's very reasonable or fair because, as Judge Tladi said in the ICJ advisory opinion, Palestine itself also has security needs and security concerns. Cheryl is asking if there's any Palestinians here. I would be very, excited to hear your views if anyone here is Palestinian. But yeah, okay. So I think. There's another question. I'm very new to international law. One of the most demoralizing things to witness was the blatantly coordinated attempt by Northern doctrinaires to normalize the premise that under the law, Palestine is not and implicitly cannot be a formal state. How do you combat this practice as scholars from or stuck in the global South? Are Southern doctrinal rebuttals desirable or even possible? Saludos desde Peru. Feliz 28. Today is Peru's Independence Day, so I'm wishing happy Independence Day. Okay. Yeah, I think the idea of Palestinian statehood is a lot more normalized in the global South as it is in the global North. So I mean, as someone who is doing that right now, as someone who is engaging with Palestinian statehood and the two-state solution from the global south, I think it's very important. I recognize that Orientalism is a powerful force in the way that the West approaches the Middle East, which is different from the way that the West approaches Latin America, for example, because in Latin America, the West sort of accepts that there is this like quote unquote shared values with Latin Americans, at least with white European descendant Latin Americans, right? They don't really care about indigenous people. Um, but they recognize those historical bonds in ways that they don't for the Middle East. They orientalize us and they otherify the Middle East. And so this has led governments in the Middle East to rarely represent the will of the Arab population of those countries. So many states have like people calling for, you know, a more aggressive stance towards Israel, and then the government says no. Um, and so I think because of this like dynamic that the Middle East is less able to engage with the West in ways that are, you know, challenging to the status quo and to the hegemonic world order, it is up to the rest of the global south to step up for Palestinians. And of course, there are exceptions. There are Middle Eastern states that are, and especially Muslim states that are very active, like Malaysia, for example, is very active in activism for Palestine, or like say, um, sorry, I would say like Qatar is very involved right now, for example, in the negotiations between Hamas and Israel. But not everyone is. Like there are the complications, let's say. So I do think that is important for the global South to step up, and this is why it's so important that it is South Africa leading the charge at the ICJ. And I think it's important that people from the global South, like myself, especially since I have access to global North academia, make this claim, because it is like you might have noticed, my views are not exactly mainstream, but they resonate a lot with the global South views. Like in Algeria, yeah, another example. The what I am saying might be weird to Western ears, but certainly not for Peruvian ears. We recognized Palestine like a decade ago. So yeah, I do think it is important for Peruvians, for South Africans, for anyone in the global South to have solidarity for other global South countries. I mean, not just Palestine, of course, for other situations. Nicaragua, so Chomnomsky and Nicaragua suing Germany, if not already mentioned. Yes, Nicaragua already. Nicaragua suing Germany is also very important. Although, of course, it is important to recognize that just because a region is from the global South doesn't mean that it is free from criticism. Nicaragua being a very clear example of a country that is very authoritarian to its own indigenous people. Its own indigenous peoples like claiming that the Nicaraguan government is subjecting them to genocide itself, and so there is a sort of like a tightrope to walk there, so that we can we can engage in solidarity to everyone in the global South. So there is an argument for supporting the Nicaragua case, while at the same time being very transparent that Nicaragua, to be consistent with its position in Palestine, should do a better job with its own indigenous communities and its religious communities that are very much oppressed right now. Yeah. Okay. So, any other questions before we? Ambiguity is everywhere. Yes, Chomdonsky, that is true. Okay. So I would say, unless anyone else has any other question, we've been here for 2 hours. I'm very excited to see that we have been able to maintain 30 viewers more or less throughout the stream. I'm very excited. I'm very enthused at the possibility of building a community of people that are interested in international law. And I think it is very valuable for me that you keep on returning, because I really, really want to leave the ivory tower. I don't want to just be talking to academics. I want to be talking to you. And so I'm going to try to find more ways to doing this. So one of the ways that I'm going to try and do this is, like I said, on Wednesday, I'm going to be playing video games and talking about international law. So I'm going to be playing The Last of Us and talking about use of force and armed conflict. So when can you actually shoot a zombie, and when can you actually shoot people in conflict and in peace? hopefully that'll be interesting. It'll be ongoing. We're not going to finish the game in one sitting, but I think it'll be a nice way of like learning about international law without you guys needing to like see my face for 2 hours, and you can have a more entertaining discussion. We can do both things. I will continue to do these longer streams about general topics. I would then ask you then, what topics would you like me to cover in these long format Q and A's? And I will happily do that next Sunday. Um, so if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, you can tell me over Twitter. Thank you so much for all the people that are being so nice about this and thanking me. Feliz 28 to Peruvian Andy. Um, Thank you, Polar Spotted Owl. I'm very happy that you like the streams. But yeah, any suggestions as to any topics that you would like to cover? It doesn't necessarily need to be Israel oriented. I know that's what's most popular right now, and I'm happy to keep on doing that. But we can talk about like decolonization. We can talk about the idea of a state again. We can talk about use of force. We can talk about self-defense. We can talk about I don't know how the UN works, how the International Court of Justice works, so on and so forth. Thank you for the Orgullos Latinoamericanos. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, as we grow this community, like please tell your friends. We can make this into an interesting space, and once you reach a certain amount of like hours streamed and followers and stuff, you start to get more a better ability to manage the channel and everything. So hopefully this will keep on growing. How the UN works would be very interesting. Yeah, that's awesome. We can totally do that. Transitional justice, I love that topic. We can talk about transitional justice from the I know Peruvian transition more than anything, but we can talk about like transitions here and there, focusing in Peru and mostly in Peru. But yeah, anyway, just let me know. I don't know if there's a more efficient way for you guys to let me know stuff, because I feel like this group here is the community, let's say. So I want you guys to have like first dibs on what we're going to discuss. So by all means, let me know. And yeah, and stay tuned for Wednesday so that we can chat about The Last of Us and human rights. Looking forward to Palestine in Ungar responding to IVJ advisory. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Okay, I don't think there is anything else to do other than to end the stream. I will leave the stream for like a couple of minutes, like 5 minutes, if you guys want to keep on chatting for a bit. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, for staying with this channel, and for helping me build this community of people that are interested in international law. I am so thrilled and so excited that you guys are interested in this. Please follow the channel and spread the word so that we can do this more often. I will see you on Wednesday and then probably on Sunday, Wednesday at 3. Okay. I'm gonna leave you now. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.